The wind above the wall bit like iron between the teeth, and the frost made a papery music where it skinned along the ice. Jon stood upon the walkway and watched the snow go booming off the edge as if the world itself were exhaling. Ghost pressed his flank to Jon's knee and looked down with him, unharmed by the cold as only a creature of the wild could be. Beyond the fall, the haunted forest stretched like an ocean caught midstorm, black boughs and white burdens heaving in a slow, relentless motion. Somewhere out there men moved, free folk retreating before winter, rangers that had not returned, wights that never tired. The world was marching toward a place without warmth. A raven alighted on the parapet beside him and clacked its beak. "Snow!" It grumbled, resentful. "Snow," Jon said, and the word was both himself and all that fell and refused to stop falling. He had come up to be alone, but the wall never allowed it long. Boots scraped, and the iron-bound door groaned behind him. Melisandre slipped out, scarlet on white, a lick of color that the wind could not extinguish. Her hair was a flame blown sideways by the gusts, her eyes dark coals. "My lord," she said, as if the title could warm him. "You are wanted." "By whom?" "By a king who does not like to wait." "Kings never do," Jon said quietly. Ghost's ears pricked, and Jon scratched him between them. "How many times must I say I am no lord?" "Names do not change the truth," Melisandre said. "Only deeds do, and you have been doing a king's work here in this cold place." She walked with him along the parapet. Below, Castle Black was a handful of black stones and smoking holes pressed into a white field. The kitchens puffed gray breath. The old rickety stairs from the yard creaked under weights of ice, and the men upon them went cautiously as if descending into their own graves. "A king's work," Jon said. "You mean sending hungry people through the gate, teaching men who hate one another to hold a shield wall together. We bleed like any others." "Not any others," she answered. "You have the sword and the will. Longclaw is only steel with a name, like any other blade." Her smile was a half thing. "It is an old blade that drinks old powers. Your father's blood clings to its edge." His father, Ned Stark, had never given him Longclaw. Jeor Mormont had. But Jon heard the truth she meant to tell and knew it would smoke in the air if he argued it here. He pushed down the steps beside her and let the wall's cold fall away as the stones of the yard rose up to meet him. The king's tower stood sharp against the white, a spear thrust into winter. Men of the queen wore bright pinches of scarlet at their collars and wrists, like blood flecks, and their eyes followed him as if he were meat carried into a kennel. Ghost padded at his heel, a silent threat none of them had sense enough to recognize. In the solar, the hearth was laid open and eating logs ravenously. Stannis Baratheon stood with his hands behind his back, facing the window as if he could force the storm to abate by the set of his jaw. Beside him, the queen's mouth was a spindle wound too tight, and Davos Seaworth, straight-shouldered, made space around him with humility. There was another, too, Shireen. Small as a winter bird, her cheek marred pale where the grayscale had left its kissing scars. Patchface sat cross-legged at her feet, bells in his antlers stuttering a sad, soft chiming with the draft. "You took your time," the king said without turning. He had a voice like a door shut in a high wind. "I was atop the wall," Jon replied. "Men look to me there. Men will look to you elsewhere soon enough," Stannis said. He turned then, eyes like the flat of a blade. "I've made my offer. You did not refuse it, and now I give it shape." Queen Celis' mouth ticked. "It is no offer," she said. "It is the king's will." Davos cleared his throat softly. "Majesty!" Stannis cut him off with a small motion of a finger. "I have no time to court coyness. Winterfell is held by curs. The North will not follow a Florent or a Baratheon banner without an old name at its point. My grace will wed you to my daughter to bind you to me and me to the North. I will make you Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and the king's own hand in the snow. The watch cannot stand forever as if it were made of stone." Jon felt Ghost lean into him, a brush of fur that steadied his bones more than the fire did. "I have taken vows. You know the words." The queen was quick. Vows to guard the realm. Vows to give your life to it. What better way to guard the realm than to take a seat that can muster 10,000 swords? Vows to father no sons, Jon said, looking at Stannis, not Celis. Vows to take no wife. The king watched him, unblinking, as if gauging a stubborn horse. Vows can be set aside when a greater vow stands in the way. The oaths of the Watch were made to kings. I am a king. Men must be more to their duty than to their words if their words bind them to ruin. I have seen too much of ruin. Melisandre's gaze had not left Jon since the door. There is more in the flames than crowns, she murmured. There is snow and ash, and a sword red with hearts, and a child with a woman's shadow behind her. Patchface plucked his bells. Under the sea, the birds have wings of salt. He sang in a thin, distant voice. They fly in circles and never come down. Shireen flinched at the sound of him and then met Jon's eyes. There was a fear in her that had nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with expectation. Sire, she said, correcting herself a moment later. My lord, they told me you are the one who saved the wall. I stood with men who did, Jon said. I did not do it alone. Nothing is done alone, Davos murmured. Least of all winning a kingdom. Stannis' gaze flicked to his hand as if to say he had spoken more than asked but had not spoken wrongly. I will not repeat myself, the king said. You will marry my daughter. We will speak our words in the yard, and on the morrow you will lay down your cloak and take up a direwolf's. We march in a week. We will march with a name the North cannot deny. The Watch will deny me, Jon said. They must. If I do this, I do it as a man apart, not the Lord Commander you hope to use. I will resign the office this day. You will do it as a man for the realm, Stannis said. Call it what you please so long as it is done. The realm is not saved by ceremonies, nor is it saved by breaking the few oaths that keep it from devouring itself, Jon returned. He heard the edge in his voice and smoothed it. Majesty, your daughter is a child. I would not. She is a princess, Celis said sharply. And you will address her so. A princess, Jon said, inclining his head. I will not harm her. There will be no betting and no talk of it. The queen's cheeks tinted with affront. Such are the customs. Customs can be cruel, Davos said softly, and Celis' eyes cut to him with a hatred she thought holy. If the marriage must be, let it be a gentle thing. Stannis considered the flame. The girl will not be bedded until she comes to womanhood. It is not required to bind the houses. Melisandre watched Jon with an intensity that felt like heat. It is required to bind destinies, she murmured. But we will do what we must at the speed the Lord's day dictates. Shireen's hand worried at her skirts, troubling the stitch that held a patch. I will do my duty, she said, and her voice trembled and did not break. Duty, Jon said quietly, is easier to speak about than to live with. He looked to Davos, who met his gaze with eyes that had learned hard truths from a hard sea. One of the man's hands was shadow, the other scarless from the knighthood he had not been born to. He had made something out of less wood than Jon had to work with. Majesty, Jon said at last, I will do this for the North. I will save what I can save. But let there be no mistake. I serve the living first, whether in castles or in the wild. If your war in the South swallows the men I need in the North, I will choose differently than you like. Stannis' mouth crooked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Then we understand one another, he said. It is better to have a man who will tell you when he disobeys than one who will nod and betray. When Jon left the Solar, the cold met him like an honest friend. Ghost shook himself and the frost flew from his coat like dust. In the yard, men were training with blunted swords, their breath smoking in the air, a ragged chorus of pant and grunt. He crossed the churned snow to the rookery. Inside, where it stank of feathers and old droppings and the curious sweetness of warm grain, Maester Aemon sat with a blanket over his knees and a cup of broth at his elbow. Jon, the old man said, hearing his step, the wind came in with you. It is always with us, Jon said. He knelt and took Eamon's hands in his. The skin was brittle as parchment and cool, not cold. "Maester, he would have me marry his daughter and take Winterfell." "I have heard," Eamon said. "The ravens speak when they are fed and when they are frightened. Sometimes they say the same thing. Sometimes they mean different things by the same word." His milky eyes lifted toward Jon's face, finding him by instinct. "What will you do? What should I do?" Jon asked and hated himself a little for needing to ask. But he had learned to do the thing that needed done, and part of that was listening. Eamon smiled a little. "My brother wanted to be a king," he said. "He was raised a prince and never thought to be otherwise. I was offered a crown once. I was a young man, and I liked the feel of my own voice in my mouth. I said no. It was the only wise thing I did for many years. But I did not say no because I feared rule. I said no because the realm needed me elsewhere more than I needed a crown. You do not have the luxury of an easy answer. If you say yes, you break the only oath you ever chose for yourself. If you say no, you abandon a chance to keep a dire winter from closing its jaws around men who cannot fend it off. Then both answers are wrong. Sometimes all answers are wrong, and you must choose the one that takes the least from the helpless." Eamon considered him. "The boy inside you will want to hold to honor like a stubborn hound clinging to a bone. The man must take that bone and throw it where it needs to go." Jon let out a breath. "I have thought to be loyal to my father's memory alone." "You are loyal to his memory when you keep the living breathing," Eamon said. "Your father was not a man for pretty words. He did ugly things with clean hands when it must be done. You know where the ugliness lies. The gods will not strike you down for refusing to let a child be cold or a house be empty of men." Eamon's fingers tightened. "But hear me, Jon. If you go to Winterfell, go as a man of the north, not as a puppet of any southern fire. Take care for the girl. There is a danger in her blood." Jon glanced at the door as if Melisandre might have burned herself into the wood there. "She speaks of fires and visions every time she sees me. She will speak of more if things go ill for her king," Eamon murmured. "Men in fear burn strange offerings. The girl's mother is pious in a way that makes her cruel. You must plant yourself between that piety and the child if you are to call yourself husband." The word husband landed in his chest like a stone. He could think of women he had kissed, of one he had loved without skill or wisdom. None of that touched this. This was a rope thrown across a gorge, and he was meant to walk it with winter under him. "I will do what I can," Jon said. "You will do more than you can," Eamon said. "That is how you know who you are." He resigned his command the same day, standing in the yard where the snow fell in tall, slow flakes that seemed to hesitate before the ground took them. The brothers watched him with a mix of anger and yearning. Some had wanted him as Lord Commander forever, because it was easier to be led than to lead. Bowen Marsh's mouth made a scar in his beard. Dennis Mallister bowed his head with old courtly sorrow. Cotter Pike spat in the snow as if to mark the place the decision had fallen. "I took the cloak knowing I might have to lay it down," Jon said. "I do it for the Watch. It must remain what it is. I will not make it an army for any king, not even the one who saved us from the wildlings, not even the one who offered me a father's name. The foe we will all face does not care whether we kneel to crowns or trees. Let men call me Oathbreaker if they like. I break this oath to keep older ones." He set the black upon the block and put his hand on it a last time, an old reflex learned in childhood before an anvil. It was only cloth and color, yet it felt like something greater. He had never held his mother. He had held this. Ghost paced a line at his back. When Jon turned, Celis' thin smile awaited him like a wound bound too tightly. She had dressed the princess in velvet the color of a Baratheon's banner, storm-dark, and around Shireen's narrow shoulders they had fastened a little cloak of rabbit fur white as bird bones. They spoke the words beneath the weirwoods, because Jon would not speak them anywhere else. The heart trees here were white-barked and red-leaved, 9 of them, old as stubbornness and twice as unwelcoming to the southern fire. The queen's men muttered and crossed themselves in a manner that was not their own, and Melisandre stood with her brazier burning. its cherry glow a small sun beneath the branches. Stannis spoke with no flourish, Davos with plain kindness when his turn came to bear witness, and Shireen did not cry. Her voice was barely a thread, but she drew it taut and did not let it break. "I will be your lady. I will be brave," she whispered, eyes on his. "I will be your lord," Jon said, and it was a thing of wood in his mouth, hollow and ringing. "I will guard you." When it was done, the queen's men waited as if for a drumroll that did not come. Celis' lips trembled with outrage and religion. Jon bowed to her, bowed to the king, and then wrapped his cloak around the girl. She was shivering, whether from cold or fear he could not say. Ghost huffed and bumped his nose softly against her gloved hand. She smiled then, a quick flash of something wild and girlish as a bird peeking from brush, and she dared to touch the direwolf's muzzle. The bells on Patchface's antlers gave a tremble of sound in the trees. There was no bedding. There was a meal and there were toasts, to which Jon raised his cup of watered wine and did not drink overmuch. Men watched him with new eyes. The brothers of the Watch watched him with eyes as old as disappointment, though some had the decency to look away when he caught them at it. Tormund Giantsbane thumped him on the back as if he were a log he meant to split and said something obscene about marriage that he tempered at the last moment into a tale about a goat and a snowdrift. Val came in fox-white furs and spoke to the princess in the language of soft things, and Shireen answered in a whisper about stories and ships and a stag carved out of the bone of a whale. Davos smiled at that and promised to find her a carver when the sea thawed. In the quiet that followed, when the long tables had been cleared and men drifted toward warmth and sleep, Jon walked with Shireen to the tower where Celis had made her court like a comb set in a hair too tight. The girl's steps were very small, and he matched them without thinking. On the stairs she paused and looked up at him. "When I am older," she said, "and you are still you, will you let me ride your wolf?" Ghost twitched an ear. Jon frowned in mock gravity. Ghost does not carry riders. It spoils his fur. "I would not mind spoiled fur," she said, and then blushed at her own boldness. "I do not think I will ever be brave enough to hunt in the snow, but I would like to see over things once." "When you are older," Jon said, "I will find a horse for you that thinks it is a wolf." "In the stories," she said, "lords give ladies songs and knights give ladies favors. I do not know what I can give you." She worried the edge of her glove with nervous fingers, then pulled something from her sleeve. It was a little stag carved from pale horn, rough but earnest, its antlers a clumsy splay. "Patchface made it," she said in a rush. "He says under the sea the stags are white. It is not the sea, but the snow is white. Would you have it?" Jon took the toy as though it might break in his hand. The oddness of taking a bride and a child in one day had tugged his insides into knots he had learned not to show. The little stag made the knot softer, like a loop you could pull if you needed to run. "I will keep him," he said, "and I will keep you." She nodded solemnly, relieved, and he left her at a door where Celis' shadow stood like an exclamation. The queen sniffed his presence as if scent itself were an offense. "You have what you wanted," Jon said to her evenly. "I will keep her safe." "She will keep you true," Celis returned. "You have the look of one who would run if the trail looked kind. It will not be kind." "No," Jon said, "it won't." Stannis left with his host when the snow broke enough to call it a road rather than an insult. He took south the queen's fiercest men, Godry-faring, men whose names sounded like iron and whose eyes slid sideways when they passed a weirwood. Asha Greyjoy was said to hold Deepwood Mott yet, and Stannis meant to pry her out like a splinter. He left Celis with her court and her red priests, and left Jon with a realm broken into shards that could either be fashioned into a blade or stepped on to bleed. The days turned into a white sameness that the smallest differences cut sharply. Jon met with Tormund and with the stewards who were learning to feed thousands who had never eaten at a table. He met with Val, who had the gift of making men do what she asked by seeming to suggest they had already decided it. He met with Bowen Marsh and received courtesy that tasted of old apples gone powdery. From the forest came flakes like ashes, and from the sea came news slow as ice, and from the south silence, as if the storm had swallowed all words and was chewing them with relish. He made the marriage a habit of kindness. He met Shireen every second day to read with her in the old library where the windows had gone blind with frost. They spoke of the building of Winterfell, the hot springs, the stones that never quite cooled, and of the first men who had taught the trees to be gods and the gods to be trees. She had a mind for numbers and loved the way they led back to themselves when you were careful. They did not speak of bedding, nor of crowns, nor of fire. Patchface would come and sit with his bells chiming in the draft, and sometimes he would say something that made Shireen laugh and Jon uneasy, and then he would giggle at his own words as if laughter were a blessing he could give himself. Melisandre came often, but not overmuch. When she came, she spoke of the war that mattered, and Jon listened without telling her that her eyes frightened him because they were too sure. She told him she saw snow and a sword like the sun, and flames that would not die if fed properly. He told her he saw men who would die in fruitless fights if they did not learn to stand together. They both told truths, and between their truths ran a gap like the one in the wall's old stones where water had gnawed a memory. Sometimes at night Jon lay without sleep and listened. He listened to the wind and to the slow, heavy breathing of ghosts on the floor. He listened to the far-off cries of men on sentry and to the way the fire cracked when it found a pocket of sap. He listened to his own heart and wondered when it would decide he belonged where he had chosen to be. He had left the watch, but the watch had not left him. Duty did not lay down just because you did. The ravens brought a letter with a seal of flayed man, and the wax was black as scabbed blood. Jon broke it over the table where he and Shireen had been reading about the shaping of iron, and the words crawled off the parchment and filled the room. It was a vile thing. Ramsay Bolton wrote as he killed, savoring the small hurt as much as the large. He named Jon bastard and traitor and thief of brides. He claimed to have smashed Stannis in the snows and to have fed the king's red priests to his dogs, and he demanded that Jon send south the queen and the princess and Mance Rayder, whom Jon had not named, and Reek, whom Jon had not held, and 10 hostages and his very head, which would be useful as a cup, he wrote, when the lips wanted warming. Shireen read over his arm, not understanding all of it and understanding too much of it. She went white as snow and then gray as old snow. Patchface sang under his breath. The dogs eat the bones eat the moon, under the sea the bones are spoons. And Jon wanted to break the bells off his antlers and fling them down the stairs, not because the fool had spoken ill, but because he had echoed the reek of the words on the page. He took the letter to the king's solar that was his now only when Stannis was north in presence in men's mouths. Celis was there with Melisandre and a clutch of queen's men sharper than knives. Davos was away south on tasks he would not name in an open room. Jon read the letter aloud and could feel the hunger it set in the worst of them. Not hunger for food, but for a cause that would let them strike. "We must answer this," Celis hissed, cheeks blotched in 2 high hot spots. "We must answer it with holy fire." "How do you answer a carrion bird but by cleaning your halls?" Jon asked, folding the parchment once and setting it down. "He writes of victories. Let him write. I will know their truth by what ravens come after. Any man can claim. Fewer can hold what they claim to hold." "Blasphemy," one of the queen's knights murmured. "You would let this insult lie? Insults are kindling to men who have lost their sense. We have not." Jon looked to Melisandre. "Is Stannis broken?" Her eyes watched the fire in the brazier. "I see snow," she said, "and fire that burns blue in a bitter wind. I see a man kneel in the snow, and an axe that falls, and the snow drinks more than it can hold. I see horses and dead men astride them. If the king falls, he falls standing." "Your sight is smoke," Celis snapped. "I need an altar. I need pure flame. We can ask the Lord of Light for victory. He asks little." Jon heard the word little like a knife. He felt Ghost stiffen, felt his hair lift on his neck. He did not see the girl's face. He knew what her mother's zeal could ask and dress as piety. "There will be no burning," he said, his voice cold as the steps to the wall. "Not of men, not of God's wood, not of any child. You will have no new altars here." "You presume in a king's house," Celis spat. "I presume in my wife's house," Jon said, and the word wife was a shield and a burden together. She is sworn to me as I am sworn to protect her. Should any man lay hand on her to drag her to flames, I will lay another kind of hand on him, and he will not like where it carries him. A murmur, sharp as a flock's rise. The queen's men bristled. Melisandre watched him with a private, measuring look, as if a long sum had just altered by one digit. Sellis' mouth worked once, then drew a line so straight it looked as if it had been carved. You would raise your hand against the chosen? I would raise my hand between a child and a fire, Jon said. I would raise both. Test me if you doubt it. That night, the yard became a chamber for a winter storm that blew from the south as if it had been kicked in the belly. The tents bucked like beasts. The wooden hoardings groaned. Jon woke from a cold, shallow sleep because Ghost was already awake and growling. The direwolf's growl filled the room like a drumroll. Jon rolled and had Longclaw in his hand before his breath turned to its second cloud. The door shuddered. A man's voice muffled. Another higher, tight with urgency. He threw the bar and opened to Tormund and Leathers, powder white from head to boot and wide-eyed. Wake Crow, Tormund said. There's blood in the tower. They ran for the queen's tower, snow stinging their eyes like thrown salt. The wind made a sound like a woman's cry and a child's cry and a raven's scold wrapped together. Jon found Ser Patrek of King's Mountain sprawled on the stair, his bright spurs splayed and his throat a red mouth that said nothing. His eyes were amazed. A second queen's man lay a few steps down with his skull caved in, as if it had been an egg that offended. The walls were white with scuff and handprints. Ghost bounded ahead of him with a low, furious whine, and Jon took the steps 3 at a time with Tormund breathing behind him and Leathers moving like a shadow getting fat on rage. At the landing beyond, the world compressed into a small space where everything mattered. One huddled there, enormous and miserable, his shoulders hunched nearly to the ceiling. He was cradling his pummeled fist and his mouth was full of a moan so deep it made the flagstones hum. Before him, pale as unslept dawn, stood Melisandre. She had both hands raised like a priestess staying a riot. Beside her, Sellis held Shireen by the upper arm so tight the little hand had gone white above the glove. Patchface crouched behind them, trembling bells chiming so fast it was near a whine. Ser Godry stood with 3 others, swords bare, and their faces were colorless with holy purpose and fear of their own righteousness. Stand aside, he was shouting, nearly weeping. Stand aside, beast. There is a sacrifice the Lord demands. No, Jon said, and Longclaw's shadow fell across the walls like a sundial's hand. He stepped between Godry and the women and Shireen. Ghost flowed to his side, a pale, low river of anger. Put up your steel. This is the king's daughter, Sellis said, as if Jon had forgotten, as if the word daughter were itself a rope to pull around the girl's neck. In her blood is victory. In her blood is child, Jon said. In her blood is fear. In her blood is the future if we let it be. He looked at Melisandre. Call them back. I do not command the queen, Melisandre said gently, as if she were soothing a skittish horse. Nor do I command her men. They have heard a call and answer it. Then hear mine, Jon said. His voice went deeper without him asking it to. Hear me, Godry Faring, and you others who think to put a child to an altar in the night. I am her lord. Take one step more and I will put you to the ground. Put your blades away and go hold your prayers in your throats where no one can see them. Godry's eyes flicked to Sellis, who nodded once, a tight, murderous thing. He lifted his sword, meaning to point it at Jon as if pointing a finger, and one unfolded. The giant rose up into the too small space in a way that made men gasp even if they had seen him do it before. He reached out, and Godry's sword may as well have been a twig for all the giant cared. One took him by the middle and squeezed. A scream burst and was cut short. Bone cracked. Blood spattered the wall like a thrown cup of wine. The other queen's men fell back in a clatter. Enough, Melisandre said softly, and laid her hand upon the giant's forearm like a coal pressed to flesh. Enough, old thing. He is done. It is done. 1-1 cast the broken knight aside. The body rolled and caught on the peak of a stair, its armor clanking a little tune. Silence fell, heavy as fur. Celis made a sound that was not a word. It was the protest of a thing that has been denied its chosen cruelty. Shireen, small and very still, looked at Jon as if he were a tree in a gale. She might hold if he did. "Princess," Jon said and reached. He did not touch her. He offered her a hand, a bridge. She took it, and he drew her behind him, sheltering her with his body in a way that would have shamed him if it had involved any other person. Patchface shuffled after, bells hitching in uneven sympathy. "No one will touch you," he told the girl, hearing how voice and promise became the same shape in that moment. Melisandre dropped her hand. She watched Jon, and in her eyes was not rage but pity, the kind that paints itself as wisdom. "You condemn many by saving one," she said. "Then I will be condemned with them," Jon said. "We will see where we all stand at dawn." It did not end in that stairwell. It moved and shifted like snow in a drift. There were men who took their swords to the queens, and there were men who told themselves they were only holding the queen's men back, but who held them hard enough to bruise. The watch could not side openly, but men were men, and more than one black cloak stood at a window with bow in hand as if watching for a deer that knew how to open doors. Jon sent Tormund with 200 free folk to take the yard and hold the gates, not against the watch but against panic. He sent Val to the rookery to bar the doors and keep the ravens for what they were, and she did it with a look that made an old undermaester trip over his own feet in his haste to obey. By dawn they had it settled with rope and talk and the weight that comes when killing has just been done and men are ashamed of how much they liked it. Shireen slept in Jon's chamber with Ghost pressed against the bedstead and Patchface snuffling in the corner, and Celis stood outside with eyes like stones that had forgotten how water moved over them. Melisandre watched where the smoke went out the window and said nothing. Jon drank broth in the still room of the kitchens and thought of what came next. The letter in his pocket burned like a coal. He had not meant to march. He had not meant to lead anything but hungry men toward full bellies and frightened men toward something like courage. He had not meant to become a lord with a house to answer an insult with steel. Yet here he was, and the insult called to more than pride. If Ramsay Bolton had crushed Stannis, then the only thing between the north and a winter ruled by flayed men was whatever Jon could cobble together. "March," Tormund said, appearing out of the steam like a bear. "I see that letter sitting in your belly. It wants out. Give it to your boots." "You will come?" Jon asked. Tormund's grin was a white cave. "Aye, there's meat at Winterfell and men who need killing and songs a man can make out of both. I never liked you much when you wore that black rag like a crown. I like you better now that you wear a woman's favor and a king's frown." "Not a favor," Jon said softly. "A small carved stag. That will do for a banner if the day is ill," Tormund laughed. "We'll stamp it in the snow for them to see." He sent ravens north to the woods where Moore's Crowfoot still painted his face and howled to make fear move in other men. West to the barrows where the dust of kings had never known crowns and where the men who hunted there felt their bones itch when something was wrong. East to the sea and White Harbor, where Lord Wyman had his cooks and his secrets and was said to be chewing on the future with a fat man's appetite. To the Queen's Crown, to the ruins of Winterfell itself, to any place a message could perch before flying to a man's hand. He sent the princess east to Eastwatch with a guard Tormund would shoulder his way through hell to keep honest. It hurt Shireen and him both to send her, but the sea was still a friend he might rely upon. There were Braavosi cogs that would risk the autumn storms yet, and Davos had friends even when he did not ask them to be. Celis breathed rage and holy grief until she nearly choked on it, but Jon was past soft words. He told her he would return her daughter in safety when it was safe and not before. He told her she might accompany if she wished, and saw her hesitate at the thought of the sea and its disdain. So he sent her too, with a priest she favored and 3 guards who had learned something from watching 1-1 close a man like a book. "Will you write to me?" Shireen asked him in the yard before she mounted, the wind catching her hood and tugging as if it were a mischievous child. "I will," Jon said. If the ink does not freeze and the ravens do not eat the words before they travel. She smiled through tears she would not let fall. I will send you sums that you must solve before you can read the letter after. That is cruel, he said. And then, so softly no one else could hear it, be brave, little stag. She nodded, and Patchface sang to himself something about ships dancing with their masts for arms. And they went. He marched 2 days later. The free folk came in a raggle of furs and axes and impossible wills. And behind them came men of the north whose banners were so tattered by weather and old disappointments that you could not see what sigil had once meant pride. There were Karstarks who had had enough of their lords' southward looks and Umbers who had grown tired of calling themselves small when they were large in the places that mattered. There were nameless men who had no lord's hall to sleep in and who came because they had decided at last that someone must decide for them. The cold made everything honest. A man beside you who stumbled was either lifted or left, and you learned a man by that choice. Jon rode in a fur-bound male hauberk with Longclaw on his hip and a dire wolf ranging silent and pale in the ditch between road and trees. He had no standard save the stolen shadow of the dire wolf and, because Tormund insisted and Jon could not stop him, the little horned stag he had made big and rough on a strip of linen. Men laughed at it, then grew quiet at it, then started to shout at it as if its clumsiness was their own courage laid bare. When the road turned to a ribbon of ice and then to something less than a road, they took the woods and cut their way through white heavy pine and naked birch. Every twig seemed to carry a burden of frost crystal as delicate as lies. The world itself creaked like an old woman. They found 3 bodies frozen together by the river, and the way their eyes had turned the color of the sky when snow was threatening made Jon's stomach go tight. He had ghost-nosing the edges of the camp before they lay down at night, and he had the free folk hold a ring of watch that would have shamed a lord's host for attention and discipline. But they were fighting wights of their own. Old griefs, hungers turned hard. On the 5th day, a rider came from the west with a banner blotted by snow and fat with pride. He flung it down in the camp and knelt on it as if it were a chair. Manderly, he announced, as if that name were a cycle and the world a kind of wheat. Where is the man who owns it? Tormund asked around a mouthful of salt horse. In a place safe from ears, the rider said with a grin. He had a face that would be handsome if it ever shut up. My lord sends word in a way that word can be sent. He tells you that the north remembers its debts and that not all crumbs that fall off a fat man's plate are for dogs. Jon smiled despite himself. Does he offer more than crumbs? He offers a scullery suited to one who does not mind the heat, the rider said. There is salt pork and brown bread and thyme in the oven if you will bring the meat. What does that mean? Tormund demanded. Ask the fat man to speak like a man and not like a cook. It means, Jon said, that White Harbor will close its gates to Bolton if we come with something that looks like a victory, and that Manderly will help us eat what we kill if we can kill it. That I can live with, Tormund grunted. They met Moore's Crowfood 2 days later near a stand of pines that had decided to grow spiteful and thick where the land climbed away from the river. He was what the stories had told, an old thing with eyes that did not believe you when you said your name. He put a painted hand on Jon's arm and squeezed it until the bones remembered what pressure was. Stark, he said, not as a title, but as a sample on the tongue. Stark, you do not wear the right look for one, but you smell of it. Ghost smells of me, Jon said. Perhaps that is what you're scenting. Perhaps, Crowfood said. Perhaps I am old enough to see ghosts where there are men. It is all the same at the end, I suppose. I have 50 men who cannot die until they do it near Winterfell stones. I give them to you because the world will not let me keep them much longer. Your gift is not lightly taken, Jon said, and meant it. He had learned the weight of men. Swords had weights that balanced in your hand. Men had weights that leaned on your soul. Near Baratheon they fell in with a pack of riders who showed him a letter with the seal of a flayed man broken and folded with the grease of many hands. It claimed, again, that the false king's host had been dashed into the snow. It claimed that Stannis banners were trophies and that the Red God had not found his godness enough to heat the king's last piss. It claimed many things, and the men who read them spat and folded the paper again and put it away as if they were tucking a snake back into their sleeves. "I will not believe a letter from a Bolton," one of the men said. "I will believe the cry of a hawk." "Believe nothing until your boots see truth," Jon said. They came upon truth in a shape made of smoke and broken wood where Deepwood Mott had been fighting to stand against the wind of men. Stannis had smashed the Ironborn there and taken a wolf's prisoner, and he had left behind not victory so much as a place where men had forgotten what it was to laugh. Jon found tracks leading east, stiff lines of trod snow and the turds of horses that had eaten desperation. Melisandre's word that Stannis would fall standing became less like smoke. That night a woman came into his camp with a face that had tried on too many grins and not liked any of them. She said her name was Rowan, but Jon did not believe names anymore. She noticed and laughed and said it did not matter, and then she told a piece of truth he had not expected to catch this far from Winterfell. "There are singers inside the castle," she said. "Singers go where they like when they sing for women with little joys. One of them is a man who used to be a king. He is not now, but he has not lost the trick of taking what is not his." "Mance," Jon said. She arched an eyebrow at that name like she might arch it at a roast with spices. "He is named by men who make names their meat. I would not call him that near the Bolton bastard, who has new knives and never tires of showing he knows how to use them. But yes, the man with the smirk and the fiddler fingers and the patience of a winter stream. He asks you to meet him at the broken peregrine stone at moonrise if you would take a small thing from a man who has eaten pride and found it sour." "What thing?" Jon asked. "The truth," she said, and smiled. "And a girl who is not the girl she pretends to be." "Arya?" He heard himself say, soft and very, very tired. "Not Arya," she said softly back, "but a girl whose skin has been forced to hold that name until it fits. Mance's women could take her out if someone on the outside made the guards look at the wrong thing for 3 full breaths." "How many breaths do I have in me?" Jon asked Tormund after she had gone. 3 seems easy until you must take them." "You have them," Tormund said. "Let us make the guards count for you." They went in near moonrise, hugging the low lies of the land. Snow hunched on the world like old men around old gossip. The broken peregrine stone was truly broken, its bird's head lying in a drift like a thought someone had dropped and then forgotten to pick up. Ghost went ahead, a shadow without a shadow, and then came back smelling of horses and unwashed fear. "What should we do?" Tormund asked. "Make noise," Jon said, and the free folk behind him grinned like wolves asked to explain their favorite hunting practices. The first fire arrow arced over the outer gate and startled the guard there so violently he nearly fell. The second one rattled off the stone like a muttered oath. The third caught in old banners that had been left flower-stiff in their hang and made a little flag of flame that licked at everything around it like a puppy learning to bite. Arrows came back at them from the wall, foolish and hurried, and men shouted a mixture of rage and alarm and words that wanted to taste someone else's fear. By the time the 4th arrow carried a bundle and the bundle burst and smelling oil painted a piece of the world in oranges and reds, a little cluster of women in torn singer's garb came slipping along the corners near the postern gate. They had a bundle too, but theirs was a girl who shook with exhaustion and who tried her best not to sob when the cold hit her face and took her breath like a thief. Not Arya, Jon told himself, and then did not care, because she was someone's child and had been made into a thing for men to prove their ownership upon. He wrapped her in his own cloak and the warmth of Tormund's shoulders and had Ghost circle them like a moving wall of teeth, and they fled into the night with noise and anger at their backs to confuse the men on the wall. On the 3rd ridge he stopped and turned and looked at Winterfell. Its broken stones and rebuilt towers rose like old teeth in an old jaw. A horn sounded there, long and lonely, not the call to war so much as the sound a creature makes when it stands up in a bad dream and cannot wake. It was then that a rider came on a mount whipped nearly white with lather, and the rider himself was white in another way. He fell from the saddle at Jon's feet and made a mess of the snow with himself. "My lord," the rider rasped. "From the south, from the king." He thrust a scrap of parchment up with fingers that looked like twigs from last year's growth. Jon took it with palms that had only just warmed after touching the girl's freezing face. The writing was not Stannis' hand. It was the hand of a man who wrote for a king who did not die. Jon read the words by moonlight and by the small fire nearby and by the way Melisandre's gaze had taught him to see heat where there was none. The words were simple. Winter had the king pinned between lake and wind and food that was all bone. They would starve, or they would freeze, or they would burn something to ask a god to unbar a door. The messenger swallowed and spoke the part the parchment would not hold. The Red Woman says the Lord will look with favor upon the king if he gives a costly gift. The queen is not there, so he asks for the next dearest thing. He asks for the princess. He asks you to send her back. There was a silence sharp enough to cut. The girl in his cloak, Jane, not Arya, another name she barely remembered, blinked up at him and tried to vanish into wool. Tormund said something very soft in his own tongue that sounded like it might be an apology to a god he didn't think was listening. Jon felt as if the world had tilted suddenly and the snow around his boots had become the roof of the sky. "I do not send children to altars," he said, and handed the parchment to Flame. It curled and blackened and fell into itself like a small, guilty thing trying to become less. "Tell the king's man this. The North will take Winterfell from the bastard of Bolton if it is the last thing it does. It will do it without a girl's screams. If Stannis Baratheon would be king, let him learn what a king is not permitted to ask." The rider stared at him as if he had taken a tooth out of the man's jaw and shown him that it was rotten. Then he nodded slowly, as if learning a song he would not have believed existed. He turned and went. The next days wrote their line in blood and breath. Men came from behind snow and under it. Boltons and their sellswords tested Jon's lines like boys prodding a sleeping bear. Jon refused to be drawn into a fight he did not choose. He kept to the cover of the trees and the ruins left by summers that had lasted longer than this winter meant to. He held the free folk in one hand and the North's bitter men in the other and tried to make fingers into a fist any smith would be proud of. He sent the girl away farther, toward White Harbor under a name that would not make men curious. He kept Mance's women near him because their eyes were knives and their hands knew where to put them. He listened to counsel he did not want and took the piece of it that fit into the place where his pride would otherwise find lodging. He slept when he could and dreamed when he could not sleep. Dreams of snow where the snow had thoughts of its own. Dreams of a heart carved small and determined. Dreams of a wolf's body that moved more surely than a man's foot could. Winterfell would not be taken by a straight charge. Ramsay had men who loved hurting more than they loved living, and men like that did not break as cleanly as men who clung to food and fear. Winterfell would be taken by hunger and certainty. Jon starved them and gave his own men certainty. On a night when the wind came around to the east and decided to knife what cheeks it could find, he sent Tormund with 20 to make noise at the western postern gate, and sent Moore's Crowfood and the men who liked the dark to cut throats at the kitchens, and sent Tormund to tear down old stock that had been set aside scantily for dogs. He did not shout for the charge until the third horn call had come from inside the walls and told him the right kind of panic had set in. The wall was climbed by men who had climbed worse. The gate was opened by hands that were desperate and bleeding. The yard rang to steel and slush and the wet sound of strikes that landed where no armor sat. Jon moved through it like a man moves through a task he has waited too long to do. Longclaw sang, and that was a thing he had never expected to think about himself, but here it was, and the song was true. Ghost kept in the corner of his eye and sometimes erupted like an accusation into the lives of men who had thought to outlive their bad habits. Ramsay Bolton did not die first. Men like him do not. They scent the wind and run toward whatever will allow them to write a new letter full of new lies. He retreated into the inner keep with his chosen men, and Jon let him because for the first time he saw where the battle was won. It was won in the faces of those who lowered their blades because for once they saw a thing larger than the fear their lord made them wear. "Open," Jon called up to the keep, voice raw with cold and blood and something like grief. "Open and I will ask less of you than the bastard asks. Open and keep your children. Open and live." He had expected mockery or more arrows or the peculiar silence of men deciding who among them they could afford to lose. He had not expected the door to open like a wound that had decided to let the poison out. A steward in a torn surcoat stood there with an expression that was nearly calm. He stepped aside. The bastard was not behind him. He had run already, perhaps by some culvert, a rat who knew his passages. "Then we hunt," Tormund said at his elbow. "No," Jon said. "We hold." He looked around the yard to see how many of his men were on their feet and how many were convincing their feet not to leave. He counted the corpses quickly, as if the numbers could be inscribed somewhere he might come back and apologize at leisure. He learned what the day had done to the faces of men he had brought with him and what it had done to the faces of men he had fought, and he knelt in the snow for a moment that was not prayer and not exhaustion but some piece of both. When he rose, he went straight to the old god's wood within the walls where the weirwood had its long carved face and where 7 centuries of quiet had been walked into the earth by feet too reverent to tread heavily. The pool there had a rim of ice like an old man's lip, and red leaves made a blood he could trust. He put his hand to the trunk and closed his eyes, and for a moment he was a boy kneeling at Winterfell with a father who had not yet taught him everything he needed to know. "Father," he said, and knew the tree did not listen and yet listened as well as anything did in this world. "I have broken what I swore. I did it to keep others from breaking. If that is pride, I own it. If that is folly, I will bear it. I am trying to make a shape out of winter that men can stand inside." Ghost's fur pressed cold at his side. Behind him the snow shifted as if it had taken a breath it did not have. He opened his eyes. The red leaves moved, although no wind came here, protected as it was by stone and winter's malaise. Felt like the tree had nodded. He would take that. He would take any small nod the world would give him. They lit no great fires that night. The men in the yard huddled over low flames as if they were lovers they did not want discovered. Jon walked among them with bread and words and the weight of what would come next. Men looked up and saw him as if he were something worth looking at. He found in that gaze no comfort, only a kind of permission. "Lord," a man said at his elbow, a deep voice softened by weariness. It was Manderly's rider, grown thinner in 10 days than he had, perhaps, in 10 years. He offered Jon a skin. Not wine, fruit heated and pressed. "My lord says men who live on snow forget what sweetness is." Jon drank and felt the heat spread, modest and kindly. "Tell your lord he speaks truth too well." The rider nodded toward the keep. "What of the Bolton?" "He ran," Jon said. "He will write his lies from someplace smaller and think himself bigger for it. We will hear of him again." "And we will hang him when we do?" the man asked hopefully. "If we can catch him," Jon said. "If not, perhaps the winter will choke him with the care he shows other lungs." He thought of letters burned and offerings refused and a king out in the snow, and his jaw ached with the clench of a decision he could not unmake. At dawn, the sun did not so much rise as change the quality of the gray. Men of the north came in small clusters, some with banners, some with nothing but their willingness. Women came clutching children tight, and old men came with stories in their eyes and knives on their belts. Jon opened the gate to them because the gate was not his and was theirs, and because he knew the only thing that made walls bearable was the knowledge that they held more safe than they held prisoner. He had the steward bring him parchment and ink that behaved like sulking animals in this cold. He wrote to White Harbor. He wrote to the Wall. He wrote to Eastwatch. He wrote to no king. He gave the letters to the fastest riders and told them to hog the road as if they owned it, because for a time they did. Shireen's letter came 3 days later, foxed at the edges in a way that was either sea damp or tears. It began with numbers that Jon dutifully solved. He had marched and slept and killed too much to mind the distraction of sums. And then without the numbers' protection, it became a little stream of words that stumbled over one another in their haste to say what they needed to say. She wrote that the sea was louder than a queen's scold, and that the wind there tasted of knives that had never killed anyone. She wrote that Patchface had tried to teach the sailors a song about fish that wore crowns, and that the sailors had laughed in the careful, polite way men laugh when they are near a princess and a fool and want to keep both in one piece. She wrote that the Bravosi captain had a nose like a paring knife and kindness in his cursing. She wrote that she was afraid when she slept because in her dreams the flames showed her faces she loved. So she had taken to counting and found that numbers were soothing because they kept their promises even when men did not. She asked, without asking, if he had kept his promise. He wrote back that he had and would. He did not say what keeping it had cost. Some prices are better paid in the quiet coin of a man's bones. On the 7th day, a scout came in with sweat frozen at the corners of his mouth and told Jon that a host had been seen across the white sweep of the lakes. Not a Bolton host, an odd one. Patches of bright colors, flags that did not belong to any one house. A scatter of red and gold that made the snow look as if it had been wounded and had decided to celebrate the wound. Lannisters so far north? Mors Crowfoot asked, incredulous. Not lions, the scout said, shivering. Merchants, sells words, men displaced. The winter is throwing everything it can find against anything that stands. Jon stood upon the battlement and looked east. The world there was the gray of a thought you cannot quite recall. It did not seem to mind what man called himself king. And in the west, faint as a secret, he thought he saw smoke moving against wind in a curious way, the way smoke moves when a man has learned to shape it on purpose. Night comes earlier every day, he said. It was not fear. It was a measurement. Tormund blew steam through his mustache with impatience. Night always comes. You only hate it when you have not finished your chores. I have not finished mine. The bastard still runs. You want to hunt, Jon said. I want to end a noise, Tormund said. Men cannot sleep when they keep listening to a thing that is not there anymore. We will hunt, Jon said, but not for him alone. He closed his eyes and saw the weirwood's patient bleeding leaves and the little horned stag in his pocket and the way Shireen's hand had reached for Ghost without fear. He saw the watch's black swaying on its peg, and Eamon's blind face turned up to feel the snakes of steam from his broth. He saw a king who would not kneel and a red woman who would not blink and a queen whose piety would rather break a child than her pride. He saw men he had brought here and men he had used and men he had saved and men he had not. He opened his eyes. Send word to Eastwatch. Have the ships carry all the food they can beg from White Harbor. Send word to Skagos. Men there eat things that would sicken softer bellies. Ask them to teach us. Send to the mountain clans and say this. Winterfell's halls have fires now, and they will not turn away those who come with axes clean. You mean to keep them all? Mors Crowfoot said, half derisive, half awed. I mean to keep enough, Jon said. I mean to have men enough when the true foe shows his face. The foe with blue eyes, Tormund said, sobering in a breath. The wind rolled a long, lonely sound across the fields. Jon nodded. Him. That night the horns sounded twice from the northern postern. Not the wild, wanton cry of a raid. Not the three that marked doom from a story told too often around fires. 2. The return of friends. All the breath went out of the yard at once, as if men had been holding it unconsciously and were now grateful to be told they might exhale. They came in hard and fast, the rangers with faces like weathered planks. One of them bore on his shoulder a bundle that coughed, then swore in a thin voice that did not go with the cough. Jon's heart jerked once and then settled. Is that the world's oldest egg? Tormund said, peering with mock solemnity. No. It is a maester that refused to hatch. Aemon Targaryen did not return. He had gone south when Jon had said he must, and the old man's bones had answered to a different wind. But the sight of those black brothers filling the gate with their stubborn shoulders made Jon feel as if something he had thrown into the dark had found its way home. Dennis Mal-Lister himself had come, wrapped like an icicle in furs, and he shook Jon's hand as if shaking a son's. You do not wear it, Mal-Lister said, glancing at the empty space where the black cloak would have hung. But you have not left it. No, Jon said, I have not. They ate that night in the great hall where no one had eaten with cheer since the songs had turned sour, and the sound of spoons was a kind of prayer. Men pressed close for warmth and because closeness is sometimes what keeps men from thinking themselves wolves. Jon walked the benches and let his hand fall to shoulders and bowls alike, a lord by necessity, a brother by the memory of his own hands in the cold. Near the end, When steam had clouded the rafters, a boy with cheeks cracked by wind stumbled in and fell to his knees in a patch of mud and beer near Jon's boots. He thrust up a scrap of parchment without looking up from the floor, as if afraid of what a lord's face might do to him. "From East Watch," he rasped. "The sea has sent us back what we thought we had thrown into it." Jon took the scrap. The hand was a neat, educated one. It said that ships were sighted in numbers beyond counting. Not enemies. Refuge. Fishermen running from strange shapes in the water and townsmen fleeing from a winter that did not respect the line between land and wave. Men and women and children. Sick men. Dead men. Men who had died twice. Eastwatch had shut its gates. Eastwatch could not shut what the sea brought. Jon folded the scrap and pressed it as if he could put it through his skin into bone. He looked at Tormund. He looked at Manderley's man. He looked at Dennis Mallister and at Moore's Crowfood and at the clansmen with their mountain winter in their eyes and at the free folk whose idea of house and hall was bigger than any stone builder had ever dreamed. "We will go to the sea," he said. "We will teach Winterfell to be a net. We will bring in what can be saved and burn what cannot before it walks. We will do it while the bastard tries to write more letters about how much bigger he is than his knives. And when we have gathered enough living men to fill these halls with breath, we will turn and give the winter an answer it will remember." He felt the silence become purpose around him just for a heartbeat. Then the hall breathed again, rough and human and aware of its own corners and needs. And men stood and began to find rope and to ask who would lead which carriage and to curse the way snow melted and made mud that made heavy things heavier. The world went on as it must and did not wait for speeches, which was precisely why men gave them. In his chamber later, with ghosts snoring like a winter storm slowed and hushed by distance, Jon set the little horned stag upon his table and looked at it for a long time. He thought of a girl counting her fear, making it into arithmetic she could solve, of a king struggling between a god's command and a man's. He thought of a child he had not delivered to fire and a brotherhood he had not truly left and a house that had taken him as a servant and now asked him to be its master. He took out a piece of parchment and wrote without thinking over much. He wrote to the sea. He wrote T. O Shireen, to tell her that the bread was good and the walls kept out most of the wind and that Ghost had stolen a ham and made a child laugh, that Val had smacked Tormund with a ladle for stealing a biscuit and that Thens could be taught to dance badly if you bribed them with enough warm wine. He wrote numbers 2, foolish ones, to please her and left small mistakes on purpose, because he had learned how a child finds joy in a teacher's errors. He did not write of sacrifices or letters with black seals or of white shadows moving inland over ice. Children learn those things soon enough when their bodies have learned how to be taller. When he blew the candle, he lay without sleep again. But it was not the wind he listened to. It was the long, slow breathing of a house that had begun to fill with men who believed. He considered the line he had stepped over and the one he would draw next. He considered a wedding vow that had not been a wedding in anything but the deepest sense, and he considered the way a direwolf's fur felt under a child's hand and how that image might become the mercy of a world. Snow fell against the shutter and hissed where it met the warmth bleeding from the fire. Somewhere out along the white, a horn answered a horn in a language men did not know and yet recognized in the backs of their skulls. He slept when he could and woke when he must. And each morning he set himself between the living and the nearest fire the winter tried to drag them to. He stood in a courtyard of a house that remembered old kings and new wrongs and held his sword so the light fell on it without glory, and he taught boys to thrust and men to hold, and he told women where water boiled fastest, and he directed men with axes where to cut new channels for life to move through. He kept a carved stag in his pocket to remind him not of a king but of a child. He studied the sky and learned how it lied. He took tidings in the way a man takes cartloads of stones and turned them into walls that would not hold forever but would hold for a while. The bastard wrote more letters. Snow ate ink when it could, and men used them to wipe knives when they had slaughterings to do because the paper was soft in a season when many things were hard. Stannis kept standing for as long as a man can stand in a wind that asks why he has not yet sat. The queen's prayers whistled like icicles in an empty hall and cut the lips of those who kissed them too often. Melisandre kept her fire, a small red defiance that refused to be ashamed of the cold's immensity. and sometimes Jon stood by it until his cheeks burned and his bones remembered that heat was not just a rumor. He did not ask her for a future. He had one already, a hall full of breathing. When the first of the dead came against the outer villages, Jon was there because he had made himself be everywhere the last 2 days. The men who met that ragged rip of black and blue and brittle ice were not ready, but they were less unready than they would have been. Jon watched an old man whose hand shook from age set his jaw and cut down the thing that had been his wife because Jon had taught him that fire must be honest or it would be a murder twice over. He watched a boy of 12 be brave then cry in that order because crying first would have undone him. He watched ghosts tear at frozen flesh with a sound that was not a growl and not a whine but something that had never been named because men have not needed to speak of it until very recently. In the end, when the day was pulled out of the sky like the last thread from a very old garment, Jon set down his sword beside a door and sat. He could feel Winterfell under him, its old bones aching, its stones thrilled by blood and warmed by soup. It would have to be enough. It would have to hold until the next dawn. All dawns are borrowed. A small hand slid into his jacket pocket then, and he knew it for memory and not flesh, but he held still as if one might startle the other. He closed his fist around the carved stag and felt its awkward antlers dig in and reassure him by not fitting his palm well. The world was ill-fitting now. He had to carry it anyway. Ghost lay at his feet and slept in the way only beasts and men who have earned their sleep manage, and somewhere out in the white, the horns were teaching each other a new kind of song. Jon rested for 3 breaths, and on the 4th he rose, gripped Longclaw, and went to make more work for morning.